The crimson dress she chose wasn't for style. It was to hide the blood splatters when the axe finally swung down. Her end was neither swift nor dignified, but a messy, heartbreaking struggle on the cold scaffold floor. After a life of golden spoons and velvet, she died stripped of everything. Even her wig fell away to reveal short, gray hair, forcing the crowd to see just how broken and unlucky this fallen queen really was. Strip away the titles, and Mary was just a woman looking for a shoulder to lean on, only to find trapdoors everywhere. She bet her life on family loyalty, only to be locked up by her own cousin for 19 years, watching her youth rot away in captivity. It all circles back to the haunting words she left behind. In my end is my beginning. She was right. She had to lose her life in the most tragic way possible, just for the world to finally remember her name. Mary Stuart's story began with a crisis, not a celebration. In December 1542, her father, King James V, lay on his deathbed at Falkland Palace, his spirit broken by a crushing defeat against the English at Solway Moss. When messengers brought news that his wife had given birth to a daughter, James famously despaired, muttering, "It came with a lass, it will go with a lass." He died 6 days later. Mary was crowned Queen of Scots before she was a week old, inheriting a divided kingdom and a vulnerable throne while vultures circled across the border. The greatest threat came from England. King Henry VIII, aging and tyrannical, saw the infant queen not as a neighbor, but as a strategic prize. He was determined to unite the crowns of England and Scotland to secure his northern border against France. His plan was simple: force a marriage between Mary and his young son, Edward. To Henry, Mary was less a human child and more a political asset that would finally break the Auld alliance between Scotland and France. Henry initially tried diplomacy, bullying the Scottish nobles into signing the Treaty of Greenwich in 1543. The treaty agreed that Mary would marry Edward when she turned 10. However, the mood in Scotland quickly soured. The Scottish people, deeply suspicious of Henry's motives and fiercely protective of their independence, realized that this was not a union of equals, but a hostile takeover. Led by Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, the Scottish Parliament rejected the treaty and renewed their ties with France. Henry's reaction was immediate and apocalyptic. He ordered the Earl of Hertford to invade Scotland with a chilling directive: put all to fire and sword, burn Edinburgh town, so that it may remain forever a perpetual memory of the vengeance of God. This marked the beginning of the rough wooing. English armies marched north, burning abbeys, destroying crops, and slaughtering civilians in a brutal attempt to terrorize the Scots into handing over their queen. While the lowlands burned, Marie de Guise fought a desperate battle to keep her daughter alive. She understood that if the English captured Mary, the Scottish monarchy would effectively end. Mary's early years were spent on the run, moved secretly from Linlithgow to Stirling Castle, and then to increasingly remote strongholds. Her nursery was effectively a mobile fortress, constantly guarded as her mother played a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with the English forces. The violence culminated in September 1547 at the Battle of Pinkie Clough, known as Black Saturday. The Scottish army was decimated by English artillery, leaving 10,000 dead on the field. With the English occupying Edinburgh and the countryside in ruins, it became clear that Scotland could no longer protect its queen. To survive, Mary would have to leave the only home she had ever known, setting the stage for her flight to France. For 5-year-old Mary, the world was a frightening place of hushed whispers, sudden midnight movements, and the distant smell of burning. She was moved to the remote Inchmahome Priory, located on an island in the middle of a lake. It was a temporary refuge, but Marie de Guise knew it wouldn't last. The English were closing in. Marie de Guise made a heart-wrenching decision. She could not protect Mary in Scotland. The only power strong enough to save her daughter and her kingdom was France. She appealed to King Henri II of France. The deal was struck. France would send an army to drive the English out of Scotland. In return, Mary would be sent to France to marry Henri's son, the Dauphin François. Scotland and France would eventually become one Catholic empire. It was a high price. Marie de Guise would have to give up her only child, perhaps never to see her again. But she was a woman of iron will. She accepted. In the summer of 1548, a French fleet arrived. They brought seasoned soldiers, artillery, and hope. But their most important cargo would be the little queen. Mary was moved to Dumbarton Castle, a fortress perched on a massive volcanic rock overlooking the River Clyde on the west coast. It was here that she prepared for her great voyage. She was just 5 years old, but observers already noted a certain regality in her. She was tall for her age, with bright auburn hair, and a charm that seemed to captivate everyone she met. Accompanying her were her 4 Marys, 4 girls of noble birth, all named Mary: Mary Beaton, Mary Seton, Mary Fleming, and Mary Livingston, chosen to be her playmates and ladies-in-waiting. They would remain her companions through triumph and disaster for decades to come. On August 7, 1548, the royal galleys weighed anchor. The parting between Mary and her mother was tearful. Marie de Guise remained on the shore, watching the sails disappear into the gray mist of the Clyde. She stayed behind to fight the English, to govern a war-torn land, and to hold the throne for the daughter she was sending away. The voyage was treacherous. The seas around Scotland are notoriously rough, and the English navy was patrolling the waters, desperate to intercept the prize. The French fleet had to take the long route, sailing north around the wild coast of Scotland and down the west of Ireland to avoid the English ships in the Channel. Mary, remarkably, did not suffer from seasickness, unlike her ladies, who were wretchedly ill. She ran about the deck, fascinated by the sailors and the vastness of the ocean. It was the first glimpse of the resilience that would define her life. She was leaving behind a land of mud, blood, and burning thatch. Ahead lay the greatest civilization of the Renaissance. After nearly 2 weeks at sea, the coast of France appeared on the horizon. The galley docked at Roscoff in Brittany. The contrast could not have been more violent. Mary had left a kingdom of gray stone and iron, where men slept in their armor and the wind howled through ruined abbeys. She stepped off the boat into a world of sunshine, silk, and unimaginable wealth. King Henri II had ordered that she be received not as a refugee, but as a reigning sovereign. Every town she passed through on her way to Paris threw open its gates. There were pageants, feasts, and flowers thrown in her path. She was the Reine d'Écosse, the Queen of Scots, and the future Queen of France. But as the little girl rode in her carriage toward the glittering court of the Valois, she carried the weight of the prophecy with her. She had escaped the English wolf, but she was entering a viper's nest of court politics that was, in its own way, just as deadly as the battlefields of Scotland. The rough wooing was over. The gilded cage awaited. If Scotland was the land of iron, France was the land of silk. When the 5-year-old Mary Stuart arrived at the French court, she was entering the cultural epicenter of the Western world. The Valois court, under King Henri II, was a place of breathtaking sophistication, artistic brilliance, and ruthless political maneuvering. It was here, amidst the chateaux of the Loire Valley and the palaces of Paris, that Mary was forged into the woman who would later captivate and confound history. King Henri II was enchanted by his new ward. He declared that Mary was the most perfect child that I have ever seen. This was not merely flattery. Mary was undeniably charismatic, while her betrothed, the Dauphin François, was a stuttering, stunted, and sickly child, often described as having a breathless manner and a pallid complexion. Mary was vibrant, healthy, and strikingly beautiful. Henri decreed that Mary should take precedence over his own daughters. She was, after all, already a crowned queen in her own right. She was raised in the royal nursery alongside the Valois children, forming a close bond with the future kings of France, Charles IX and Henri III, and, most importantly, with the young François. Despite the political nature of their union, a genuine tenderness developed between Mary and François. She became his protector, his confidant, and his eyes and ears. She spoke for him when he stuttered. She stood tall beside him when he faltered. It was a relationship built not on romantic passion, but on a deep shared childhood. Her education was extraordinary, even by royal standards. The Renaissance ideal was the universal man, and Mary was raised to be a universal woman. Under the guidance of the finest tutors in Europe, she mastered French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and Greek. She studied history, geography, and moral philosophy, but she was also trained in the arts of courtliness. She learned to play the lute and the virginals, a precursor to the piano. She possessed a sweet singing voice and wrote poetry that was admired by the likes of Pierre de Ronsard, the prince of poets. She loved to dance, moving with a grace that drew every eye in the room. Physically, she grew to be exceptionally tall, nearly 6 feet by adulthood, giving her a natural physical dominance that matched her rank. She excelled at falconry, hunting, and horsemanship, often exhausting the men who tried to keep pace with her. However, the French court was not just a finishing school, it was a shark tank. Mary's power in France stemmed from her mother's family, the House of Guise. Her uncles, Duke Francis of Guise, a brilliant general, and Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, a cunning statesman, were two of the most powerful men in Europe. They were ambitious, ultra-Catholic, and viewed their niece Mary as the ultimate vehicle for their family's glorification. They hovered over her education, ensuring she was raised to be a staunch Catholic and a tool of French imperialism. Watching from the shadows was Catherine de' Medici. The Queen of France, wife of Henri II, was a woman of immense patience and hidden steel. In the 1550s, Catherine was pushed to the sidelines. Her husband openly adored his mistress, the legendary beauty Diane de Poitiers, who acted more like the queen than Catherine did. Catherine watched Mary Stuart, this golden, glowing girl who was the niece of her rivals, the Guises. With a cold, detached eye, Mary, in her youthful arrogance, made a dangerous enemy. It is whispered that the young Mary once referred to Catherine as the merchant's daughter, a slur on the Medici family's banking origins. Whether true or not, Catherine never forgot a slight. She saw Mary not as a daughter but as a threat, a Guise puppet who would one day supplant her. The turning point of Mary's life, the moment that sealed her fate, occurred in 1558. On April 24th, 1558, the 15-year-old Mary married the 14-year-old François in a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur at Notre Dame Cathedral. The crowd was so dense that people hung from the gargoyles to catch a glimpse of the Scottish queen. She wore a dress of white, shocking, as white was traditionally the color of mourning for French queens, embroidered with lilies and diamonds. It was a dazzling statement of purity and majesty. But just months later, in November 1558, Mary Tudor of England, Bloody Mary, died. The throne passed to her half-sister Elizabeth I. To the Catholic powers of Europe, Elizabeth was a bastard. Her father, Henry VIII, had married her mother, Anne Boleyn, while his first wife was still alive, and the Pope had not annulled the marriage. Therefore, in the eyes of canon law, Elizabeth had no right to the throne. Who was the rightful heir? The great-granddaughter of Henry VII, Mary, Queen of Scots. King Henri II of France, eager to expand his empire, made a catastrophic decision. He formally proclaimed his daughter-in-law Mary to be the Queen of England, Ireland, and Scotland. He ordered that the English royal arms be quartered with Mary's own. The dinner plate Mary ate from, the tapestries in her chambers, and the livery of her servants were all emblazoned with the English lions. It was a declaration of war by heraldry. Across the English Channel, the new young Queen Elizabeth I stared at these symbols with a cold fury. She realized that as long as Mary Stuart lived, her own throne was insecure. The rivalry had begun. The golden age of Mary's life shattered in the summer of 1559. During a celebratory jousting tournament in Paris, King Henri II insisted on riding one last tilt against the captain of his Scots guard. It was a freak accident. The captain's lance shattered, and a splinter of wood pierced the king's visor, driving through his eye and into his brain. The king died in agony 10 days later. Suddenly, the sickly Francois was King Francois II. Mary Stuart, at 16, was Queen of France and Scotland and claimant to England. She was arguably the most powerful woman in the world. Her Guy's uncles effectively seized control of the government, sidelining Catherine de' Medici. But the foundation of Mary's power was the heartbeat of her frail husband. Francois's health, always poor, began to collapse under the strain of kingship. He suffered from recurring ear infections and vapors in the head. In late 1560, a severe infection took hold. It was likely mastoiditis. The infection in his ear turned into an abscess that spread to his brain. The treatments of the time, bleeding and purging, only weakened him further. On December 5th, 1560, just a week before Mary's 18th birthday, King Francois II died. The silence that followed was deafening. Mary's world disintegrated overnight. With Francois dead, she was no longer needed in France. The power dynamic shifted instantly. Catherine de' Medici, the merchant's daughter, stepped out of the shadows to become regent for her next son, the 10-year-old Charles IX. Catherine had waited decades for this moment. She had no intention of letting the Guise family or their niece Mary retain power. Mary was plunged into deep mourning. She secluded herself in a darkened chamber for 40 days, a tradition known as Nuit Blanche, white mourning, wearing a white veil and dress. Her grief was genuine. She had lost her childhood companion and her protector, but her political grief was even sharper. She was now a dowager queen in a court that wanted her gone. Catherine de' Medici made it subtly clear there was no place for Mary in France. Mary had two choices. She could stay in France as a marginalized dowager, living on her estates watching her glory fade, or she could do the terrifying thing, return to Scotland. The decision to return was fraught with danger. Scotland had changed drastically in the 13 years she had been away. It was no longer the Catholic country she left. The Protestant Reformation, led by the fiery preacher John Knox, had swept through the lowlands. The lords of the congregation, a group of Protestant nobles, now held significant power. They had outlawed the Catholic Mass. Mary was a devout Catholic queen returning to a fiercely Protestant nation. It was a recipe for civil war. Furthermore, Queen Elizabeth I of England refused to give Mary a safe conduct pass to sail through English waters unless Mary signed the Treaty of Edinburgh, a document renouncing her claim to the English throne. Mary, proud and defiant, refused. She would sail effectively as a fugitive, risking capture by the English Navy. On August 14, 1561, Mary boarded a galley at Calais. As the ship pulled away from the French coast, Mary stood at the stern, leaning on the rail, weeping. She watched the coastline until it disappeared into the twilight. "Adieu, France," she was heard to whisper over and over. "Adieu, my beloved France. I think I shall never see you again." The voyage was ominous. A dense, unnatural fog descended on the North Sea, wrapping the ships in a gray shroud for days. It was so thick that the sailors could barely see the prow of the ship. It protected Mary from the English fleet, which was indeed hunting for her, but it also served as a grim metaphor. She was sailing blindly into a future she could not see. On August 19, 1561, the galley docked at Leith, the port of Edinburgh. The arrival was a shambles. No one expected her so soon due to the fog. There was no welcoming committee, no carpets, no pageantry. The palace of Holyrood House was unprepared. The 18-year-old widow, accustomed to the finest luxuries of the Louvre, had to wait while her subjects scrambled to find horses to transport her. When she finally entered Edinburgh, the contrast was shocking. The city was dark, smelling of coal smoke and open sewage. The people who stared at her were rugged, suspicious, and armed. That first night at Holyrood Palace, a group of citizens gathered under her window. They did not play the lute or sing courtly madrigals. They sang rough Protestant psalms, accompanied by out-of-tune fiddles. It was meant as a welcome, but to Mary's refined ears it sounded like a discord. She was home. She was the queen. But as she looked out at the dark, foggy hills of Scotland, she must have realized she was essentially alone. The wolves were waiting. And the loudest wolf of all, John Knox, was preparing his pulpit. When Mary Stuart stepped onto Scottish soil in August 1561, she walked into a political minefield. She was a Catholic monarch in a country that had legally abolished the Mass. She was a woman in a land dominated by warlords. And she was young, just 18, facing veteran schemers who had been playing the Game of Thrones since before she was born. Yet the early years of her personal rule were deceptively successful. Mary possessed a political instinct that surprised her critics. She did not attempt to roll back the Protestant Reformation by force. Instead, she issued a proclamation forbidding any alteration to the state of religion she found upon her arrival, while privately maintaining her own Catholic chapel at Holyrood. It was a pragmatic compromise, brokered largely by her illegitimate half-brother, Lord James Stuart, later the Earl of Moray, and her Secretary of State, William Maitland of Lithington. For 4 years, Scotland enjoyed a rare stability. But there was one voice that would not be silenced. John Knox, the architect of the Scottish Reformation, was a man of fire and brimstone. To Knox, Mary was not just a political opponent. She was Jezebel, an idolatress, whose very presence brought the wrath of God upon the land. Their encounters are legendary. Mary summoned Knox to Holyrood several times, hoping her charm and intellect could bridge the divide. It was a collision of two worlds: the Renaissance queen, accustomed to debate and nuance, versus the Old Testament prophet who dealt in absolutes. In their interviews, Knox was brutally frank. When Mary asked if subjects had the right to resist their princes, Knox famously replied that if a father goes mad and tries to kill his children, the children have a right to bind his hands and take the sword from him. He was telling the queen to her face that her power was conditional. Mary, often reduced to tears of frustration by his intransigence, realized that as long as Knox preached, her throne stood on shifting sand. By 1565, the pressure for Mary to remarry was immense. She was the most eligible woman in Europe. Kings from Sweden, Denmark, and France courted her. Even Queen Elizabeth I of England played games, bizarrely suggesting her own favorite, Robert Dudley, as a husband for Mary, a move designed to neutralize Mary's power. But Mary, usually so politically astute, made a decision driven by blood and sudden infatuation. In February 1565, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, arrived at the Scottish court. He was Mary's first cousin. Like her, he was a grandchild of Margaret Tudor, which meant he also had a claim to the English throne. Marrying him would unite their claims and make their children the indisputable heirs to England. But Mary wasn't looking at his lineage. She was looking at him. Darnley was 19, tall, over 6 feet, like Mary, athletic and golden-haired. He played the lute, danced well, and had the polished manners of the English court where he had been raised. Mary, starving for someone who matched her in stature and culture, was instantly smitten. She described him as the lustiest and best proportioned long man she had ever seen. It was a fatal misjudgment. The golden exterior hid a vacuum of character. Darnley was narcissistic, intellectually shallow, vicious, and a heavy drinker. Her half-brother Moray saw the danger immediately and warned against the match. Elizabeth of Arthur was furious, viewing the union as a direct threat to her own crown. Mary ignored them all. "I will have him," she declared. On July 29th, 1565, Mary married Darnley at Holyrood Palace. She wore black velvet, again the color of mourning, perhaps because she was a widow, or perhaps it was an unconscious omen. The marriage shattered the peace of Scotland. Her brother Moray, disgusted by Darnley and fearing the return of Catholic dominance, launched a rebellion. This was Mary's finest military hour. Showing the steel of her ancestors, she didn't hide in a castle. She rode out at the head of her army, pistols at her saddlebow, wearing a steel cap and a light coat of armor. She chased her rebellious brother and his forces through the driving rain and wind of the Scottish autumn, a campaign known as the Chase-About Raid. She outmaneuvered them completely. Moray was forced to flee across the border into England. Mary was triumphant. She had her kingdom, her army, and her husband. But the victory was short-lived. The moment the external threat was gone, the internal rot began. Darnley was not content with being the Queen's consort, king consort. He demanded the crown matrimonial, a legal right that would make him king with equal power to Mary and allow him to retain the crown even if she died. Mary, having quickly realized that her husband was an incompetent drunkard who spent his nights in Edinburgh's brothels, refused. She began to sideline him, denying him access to state secrets. Darnley grew sullen and vindictive. He felt emasculated. Into this toxic atmosphere stepped David Rizzio. Rizzio was a Piedmontese musician who had risen to become Mary's private secretary for French correspondence. He was ugly, small, and flamboyant, but he was intelligent, loyal, and good company. Mary, isolated by her husband's boorishness, relied on Rizzio for advice and friendship. They played cards until late at night. He organized her masques. Darnley's jealousy, fueled by Protestant lords who wanted to return from exile, turned murderous. The conspirators whispered in Darnley's ear that Rizzio was more than a secretary, that he was Mary's lover, and perhaps even the father of the child she was now carrying. They hatched a plot. They would kill Rizzio, imprison Mary, and grant Darnley the crown matrimonial. Saturday, March 9th, 1566. It is one of the most vividly documented nights in Scottish history. Mary, 6 months pregnant, was hosting a small supper party in her private closet off her bedchamber at Holyrood. It was an intimate space, barely large enough for a table. Sitting with her were Rizzio and a few trusted friends. Suddenly the private staircase door opened. Lord Darnley entered. He sat beside Mary and put his arm around her, an awkward, drunken gesture. Then the main door burst open. Lord Ruthven, a terrifying figure, entered. Ruthven was dying of an internal illness. He was pale, gaunt, and clad in full armor, looking like a ghost come to claim a soul. Behind him were other armed men. "Let it please your majesty," Ruthven rasped, "that yonder man David come forth of your privy chamber where he has been too long." Mary stood, her royal bearing intact. "He is here by my will," she said. The room erupted into chaos. The table was overturned. Rizzio, realizing he was the target, scrambled behind Mary, clutching the folds of her skirt. Justitia, madame. Sauve ma vie. Justice, madame. 1. Save my life, he screamed. Darnley grabbed the pregnant queen, pinning her arms to prevent her from intervening. One of the conspirators, George Douglas, snatched Darnley's dagger and reached over the queen's shoulder, stabbing Rizzio. They dragged the screaming Italian out of the closet, through the bedchamber, and into the outer presence chamber. There, they fell upon him like a pack of wolves. He was stabbed 56 times. They left his bright satin clothes tattered and soaked in blood, the dagger still sticking out of his chest. Inside the closet, Darnley released Mary. She turned on him, her shock turning to cold fury. "My lord, why have you done this?" When she was told Rizzio was dead, she famously dried her eyes. "No more tears now," she said. "I will think upon revenge." Mary was a prisoner in her own palace, surrounded by men who had just committed treason. But she possessed a weapon they underestimated, her influence over her weak-minded husband. Over the next 24 hours, Mary worked on Darnley. She played on his fears. She told him the other lords were using him and would discard him. She told him that if her child died, his link to the crown died with it. Darnley, panicked and easily manipulated, switched sides again. In the middle of the night, the pregnant queen and her husband sneaked out of the palace through the servants' quarters, past the fresh grave of David Rizzio in the Abbey cemetery. They rode furiously to Dunbar Castle. From Dunbar, Mary summoned her loyal lords. Within days, she marched back to Edinburgh with thousands of men. The conspirators fled. Mary had survived, but the marriage was dead. On June 19, 1566, in the tiny, secure birthing room of Edinburgh Castle, Mary gave birth to a son, James. The heir was born. The future King of Scotland and England had arrived. But the birth did not heal the rift with Darnley. He was now a pariah. The Protestant lords hated him for betraying their plot. The Catholics hated him for the murder of Rizzio. Mary loathed him. He was a man with no friends. By late 1566, at a conference at Craigmillar Castle, Mary's leading nobles, including the Earl of Bothwell, a rugged and powerful lord who had remained loyal to her, discussed the problem of Darnley. The phrase used was that he should be removed. Mary was present. She asked that nothing be done that would spot her honor, but the wheels were turning. In early 1567, Darnley fell ill in Glasgow. His body was covered in pustules, officially smallpox, likely syphilis. Mary brought him back to Edinburgh, but not to Holyrood. He was lodged in the old provost's lodging at Kirk-o-Field, a house just inside the city walls. It was quiet, elevated, and supposedly good for his recovery. Mary visited him daily. On the night of Sunday, February 9th, she spent several hours with him. She seemed reconciled, even promising to stay the night. But at the last moment, she remembered she had promised to attend a wedding masque for one of her servants at Holyrood. She kissed Darnley goodbye and left by torchlight. Around 10 p.m., Darnley was left alone with his valet. He read a psalm, drank some wine, and went to bed. At 2 a.m., on February 10, 1567, a thunderous explosion shook the city of Edinburgh. It was so loud it woke the entire capital. People rushed to Kirk-o-Field. The house was gone. It had been packed with gunpowder in the cellars, enough to reduce the stone building to a pile of rubble. But the mystery was in the garden. Darnley's body was not found in the ruins. He was found lying on the grass in an orchard nearby, dressed only in his nightshirt. Next to him was his valet. There wasn't a mark on them. No burns, no blast injuries. Beside them lay a chair, a rope, and a dagger. The king had not been blown up. He had heard something, or smelled the burning fuse and tried to escape the house. He had been caught in the garden and strangled to death, moments before the house exploded behind him. The king was dead. And as the smoke drifted over Edinburgh, every eye turned to the Earl of Bothwell and to the Queen herself. The explosion at Kirkfield did not just destroy a house, it blew the Stuart monarchy apart. In the days following the murder of King Henry, Lord Darnley, Edinburgh was a city of whispers and terror. The public demanded justice. Everyone knew, or thought they knew, who was responsible. The name on every pair of lips was James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was the antithesis of Darnley. He was a rough-hewn border lord, a man of action rather than words, fiercely loyal to Mary, but reckless and ambitious. To the people, he was the black-hearted villain. But the suspicion did not stop at Bothwell. It crept upwards toward the Queen herself. Why had she removed Darnley from the safety of the castle? Why had she left him alone on that specific night? Under the cover of darkness, anonymous placards began appearing on the streets of Edinburgh. One famously depicted a mermaid, a symbol for a prostitute due to the comb and mirror representing vanity, and a hare, the crest of Bothwell. The message was clear. The Queen and her lover had conspired to kill the king. Mary's behavior during this crisis remains the subject of intense historical debate. Instead of aggressively hunting down the killers, she seemed paralyzed. She retreated into herself, overwhelmed by shock or perhaps guilt. She allowed Bothwell to take charge of the security of the palace, effectively putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. Pressure mounted from abroad. Queen Elizabeth I wrote a remarkably candid letter to Mary. I should not do the office of a faithful cousin or an affectionate friend if I did not. Tell you what all the world is thinking. Men say that, instead of seizing the murderers, you are looking through your fingers while they escape. Mary had no choice. She ordered a trial, but it was a farce. On April the 12th, 1567, Bothwell rode to the toll booth in Edinburgh to stand trial for the murder of the king. He did not ride as a prisoner, but as a conqueror. He was escorted by 4,000 of his own armed supporters. The Earl of Lennox, Darnley's father, who was supposed to present the evidence against him, was too terrified to enter the city. With no accuser present and the jury packed with Bothwell's allies, the verdict was delivered in hours, not guilty. To celebrate, Bothwell hosted a supper at Ainsley's Tavern. There, he coerced or bribed the leading lords of Scotland to sign the Ainsley Tavern Bond, a document pledging to support him, and, crucially, recommending that he should marry the Queen. On April 21st, Mary went to Stirling Castle to visit her 10-month-old son, Prince James. It was the last time she would ever see him. On her return journey to Edinburgh on April 24th, near Almond Bridge, her small entourage was intercepted. Bothwell appeared with 800 spearmen. He rode up to the Queen's horse, took the bridle, and told her that danger awaited her in Edinburgh. He claimed he needed to take her to his stronghold, Dunbar Castle, for her own safety. Mary's bodyguards did not draw their swords. Mary did not scream. She went with him. This event is the black hole of Mary's history. Was it a kidnapping? Or was it an elopement disguised as an abduction to save the Queen's reputation? Mary later stated that Bothwell had ravished her, raped her, and that she had no choice but to marry him to restore her honor. If it was a plot, then Mary was a willing participant, ready to marry the man she loved despite the blood on his hands. One historians are divided, but the outcome was the same. On May 15, 1567, at Holyrood Palace, Mary, Queen of Scots, married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. It was the single greatest political blunder of the 16th century. The marriage was a disaster from day one. There were no celebrations. Mary appeared distraught, reportedly threatening suicide and calling for a knife to kill herself. Bothwell was boorish and jealous, reducing her to tears. The country revolted. The sight of their queen marrying the man publicly believed to be her husband's murderer was too much for the Scottish nobility. The Confederate lords, a coalition of Protestants and Catholics alike, raised an army to liberate the queen from the tyrant Bothwell. The confrontation took place on June 15th, 1567, at Carberry Hill, just outside Edinburgh. It was a sweltering hot day. The two armies faced each other across the valley, banners waving. But there was no battle. Mary's army simply refused to fight. They would not die for Bothwell. As the hours ticked by, Mary's soldiers drifted away, going home to their farms. Realizing the game was up, Bothwell offered to fight any of the rebel lords in single combat. Several accepted, but Mary forbade it. Finally, a deal was struck. The lords promised to return Mary to her throne if she abandoned Bothwell. They shared a brief, final conversation on the hill. Bothwell mounted his horse and galloped away, heading north to his ships. He would eventually flee to Scandinavia, where he was captured by the King of Denmark and chained to a pillar in a dungeon for 10 years, dying insane and covered in filth. Mary never saw him again. Mary turned to the rebel lords expecting to be treated as a queen. Instead, they treated her as a prisoner. As she was marched back to Edinburgh, the soldiers shouted insults at her. "Burn the whore! Burn the murderess!" They held up a banner depicting the dead Darnley and her crying son, shoving it in her face. She was locked in the provost's house in Edinburgh, disheveled, starving, and screaming from the window to the mob below, her clothes torn, her chest exposed. The majestic Queen of France was gone. In her place was a broken woman. The lords knew they could not keep her in the capital. The mob was too volatile. In the dead of night, they moved her to Loch Leven Castle. This was a fortress built on a small island in the middle of a loch. The jailer was Sir William Douglas, a relative of the Earl of Moray. It was here in the gloom of the island tower that Mary hit rock bottom. Between July 18th and July 24th, she suffered a miscarriage. The remains were buried on the island. She had been carrying twins, Bothwell's children. While she was still bleeding and weak, facing the threat of execution, the lords sent a delegation to her cell. They presented her with deeds of abdication. They told her bluntly, "Sign, or we will cut your throat." On July 24th, 1567, a weeping Mary Stuart signed the papers. She abdicated the throne in favor of her 1-year-old son, James VI. Her half-brother, Moray, was named regent. On July 29th, the infant James was crowned king at Stirling. John Knox preached the sermon. Mary was not even invited. For nearly a year, Mary remained a prisoner. The world moved on. Moray ruled Scotland with an iron fist. Elizabeth I in England, though horrified by the rebellion against a fellow monarch, did nothing to help. But Mary's legendary charm was still intact. Even in prison, she began to turn her captors. She befriended George Douglas, the younger brother of the castle's lord. Captivated by the beautiful, tragic queen, George began to plot her escape. The first attempt failed. Mary tried to leave disguised as a laundress, but the boatman spotted her exquisite white hands and realized she was no washerwoman. The second attempt, on May 2nd, 1568, was a masterpiece of simplicity. A young page boy, Willie Douglas, an orphan adopted by the clan, managed to steal the castle keys from the table while the castellan was eating supper. He dropped a napkin over them and lifted them. Willie signaled Mary. She slipped out of her tower, crossed the courtyard, and exited the postern gate. Willie locked the heavy gates behind them, trapping the garrison inside, and threw the keys into the lock. They jumped into a waiting boat. Mary grabbed an oar and helped row. As they reached the shore, loyal lords were waiting with horses. The Queen was free. The news of Mary's escape hit Scotland like a thunderclap. The Queen is free. Loyal supporters flocked to her banner. Within days, she had an army of 6,000 men, Hamiltons, Setons, Flemings. She was once again a force to be reckoned with. Her intention was to reach Dumbarton Castle, a stronghold on the west coast, where she could hold out and wait for French reinforcements. But the regent Moray was a seasoned general. He moved his smaller, more disciplined army to intercept her. The armies collided on May 13th, 1568 at Langside, near Glasgow. It was a chaotic skirmish that lasted less than an hour. Moray's harquebusiers, musketeers, were positioned behind hedgerows and decimated Mary's charging cavalry. Mary watched the battle from a nearby hill. When she saw her lines break and her men flee, she knew it was over. This was not a tactical retreat, it was a rout. Terrified of being captured again, knowing this time she would likely be executed or burned, she turned her horse south. Mary rode with the desperation of the hunted. She and a small group of faithful companions rode 60 miles without stopping, sleeping on the hard ground, eating oatmeal and sour milk. She cut her beautiful auburn hair short to disguise herself. She reached the Solway Firth, the body of water separating Scotland from England. She faced the most critical decision of her life. She could go to France, where she had been queen, but she would return as a failure. Or she could go to England. Mary convinced herself that Elizabeth I was her friend. They were sister queens. They had exchanged affectionate letters for years. Surely, Elizabeth would give her an army to reclaim her throne. Her advisers begged her not to go. England is the grave of Scots, they warned. Mary would not listen. On May 16, 1568, she boarded a small fishing boat at Dundrennan Abbey. As the boat pushed off into the grey waters of the Solway, Mary Stuart looked back at the hills of Scotland. She was 25 years old. She would never set foot in Scotland again. She believed she was sailing toward the warm embrace of a sister queen. In reality, she was sailing into a tomb. When Mary Stuart stepped out of the fishing boat onto the pebble beach at Workington in Cumberland on the evening of May 16, 1568, she believed the worst was over. She was 25 years old, exhausted, penniless, and dressed in borrowed clothes. But she was in England. She was in the land of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. Mary wrote a letter to Elizabeth immediately, famously stating, "I am now forced out of my kingdom and driven to such straits that, excepting God, I have no hope but in your majesty." She expected an invitation to court. She expected an army to be mustered to punish the Scottish rebels. She received neither. For Elizabeth I and her chief adviser, William Cecil, Mary's arrival was a political nightmare. They analyzed the situation with cold logic. If they restored Mary to the Scottish throne by force, they would be destroying their own allies, the Protestant Scottish lords, and installing a pro-French Catholic on their northern border. If they handed Mary back to the Scots, she would almost certainly be executed, setting a dangerous precedent that subjects could kill their sovereigns. If they let her go to France, she would raise a French army and return to threaten England. So Elizabeth chose the fourth option. She did nothing, or rather she chose honorable custody. Mary was moved to Carlisle Castle. She was treated with the respect due a queen. She had her own household, her cloth of estate, and her servants. But the gates were locked. She was told she could not see Elizabeth until her name was cleared of the horrible accusations regarding Lord Darnley's murder. Mary was outraged. She was an anointed queen. She answered only to God, not to an English court. But the trap had snapped shut. To justify keeping a foreign queen in prison, the English government needed evidence of her guilt. The regent Moray, Mary's half-brother, was happy to provide it. In late 1568, an inquiry was held. first at York and then at Westminster. The Scottish lords produced the casket letters. This is one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The evidence consisted of a silver gilt casket, a small jewelry box, allegedly found under the bed of one of Bothwell's servants. Inside were 8 letters and a series of sonnets written in French, purportedly from Mary to Bothwell. If genuine, they were damning. They contain passages where the writer expressed deep hatred for Darnley, the leper, and seemed to be conspiring with Bothwell to lure him to his death. One letter, the famous Glasgow letter, was thousands of words long, allegedly written by Mary while she sat by the sickbed of her husband, plotting his murder. Mary cried foul immediately. She was never allowed to see the originals. She was only shown copies. She insisted they were forgeries, cobbled together by her enemies, using her real handwriting interspersed with fabricated paragraphs. The inquiry was a masterclass in political ambiguity. The English commissioners looked at the letters and compared the handwriting. They decided that the letters were probably genuine, but they did not issue a guilty verdict. Instead, they issued a non-proven verdict. It was the perfect result for Elizabeth. Mary was not found guilty, which would require her execution, but she was not found innocent, which would require her release. The cloud of guilt was enough to keep her locked up forever. The years began to blur. Mary was moved deeper into England, away from the coast and potential rescuers. She spent 14 years in the custody of George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, and his formidable wife, Bess of Hardwicke. They moved her between their various properties: Tutbury Castle, Sheffield Manor, Wingfield Manor. Tutbury was the worst, a damp, drafty fortress on a wind-swept hill. The castle sat above a marsh that stank of sewage. Mary's health began to collapse. The vibrant, athletic woman who could ride 50 miles a day was now confined to a few rooms. She developed severe rheumatism and a mysterious pain in her side, possibly porphyria or gastric ulcers. Her legs swelled so badly she often could not walk. She gained weight, her figure thickening from lack of exercise and a rich diet. Yet her spirit remained unbroken. She created a court in exile. She spent hours at her needlework, embroidering intricate panels with Bess of Hardwicke. These were not just hobbies, they were coded messages. She embroidered a cat, Elizabeth, playing with a mouse, Mary. She embroidered a bird in a cage. She used her needle to assert her status when her pen was taken away. As the years dragged on, the politics of Europe darkened. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis. It was a bombshell. It formally excommunicated Queen Elizabeth I, declaring her a heretic and releasing all English Catholics from their allegiance to her. Overnight, Mary Stuart transformed from a political prisoner into a religious weapon. To every devout Catholic in England, Mary was the rightful queen. Plots began to swirl around her like moths to a flame. The Ridolfi plot, 1571, involved a banker named Roberto Ridolfi, who plotted to marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk, invade with Spanish troops, and seize London. The plot was discovered, and the Duke of Norfolk was beheaded. Mary was kept alive, but her confinement became stricter. Mary's involvement in these plots is debated. Was she the architect, or was she just a desperate woman listening to anyone who promised her freedom? She wrote thousands of letters in cipher, smuggled out in the heels of shoes, in beer barrels, and in laundry baskets. She was fighting for her life with ink and paper. Against Mary stood one of the most terrifying figures of the Elizabethan age, Sir Francis Walsingham. Walsingham was Elizabeth's principal secretary and spymaster. He was a devout Puritan who believed Mary was the bosom serpent, the source of all danger to England. He believed that, as long as Mary lived, Elizabeth's life was in danger. He was determined to cut the head off the snake. But Elizabeth refused to execute her cousin. She believed in the divine right of kings. Monarchs were chosen by God and could not be killed by mortals. Walsingham knew he needed irrefutable proof. He needed to catch Mary red-handed, endorsing the assassination of Elizabeth. In 1585, Parliament passed the Act for the Surety of the Queen's Person. It stated that if any plot to kill Elizabeth was discovered, the person on whose behalf the plot was made, Mary, would be just as guilty as the assassins, even if she didn't wield the knife. By 1586, Mary was moved to the custody of a new jailer, Sir Amias Paulet. Paulet was a strict Puritan who despised Mary. He stripped away her comforts. He stopped her secret letters. She was held at Chartley Hall, completely isolated from the world. She was 43, crippled, lonely, and desperate. Into this silence, Walsingham introduced a leak. He used a double agent, Gilbert Gifford, to approach Mary. Gifford told her he had found a secure way to smuggle letters in and out using a beer brewer who supplied the castle. The letters would be hidden in a watertight cork tube inside the beer barrel. Mary was overjoyed. The channel opened. She began communicating again, but she didn't know that Walsingham had built the entire system. Every single letter Mary wrote, and every letter she received went straight to Walsingham's desk first. His codebreaker, Thomas Philippus, deciphered them, copied them, and then sent them on. Walsingham sat back and waited. He watched as a young, foolish Catholic nobleman named Anthony Babington began to write to Mary. Babington was romantic and reckless. He gathered a group of friends and swore to kill Elizabeth and rescue Mary. In July 1586, Babington wrote the fatal letter. He outlined the plan: a foreign invasion, the rescue of Mary, and the tragic execution of the usurper Elizabeth. He asked Mary for her approval. This was the moment Walsingham had waited 19 years for. If Mary replied and forbade the murder, she was safe. If she ignored it, she was safe. But Mary was tired. She was dying by inches. She saw a chance for freedom. On July 17, 1586, Mary dictated her reply to her secretaries. She went through the details of the invasion and her rescue. Crucially, ominously, she did not object to the tragic execution of Elizabeth. She implicitly endorsed the assassination. Walsingham's codebreaker, Philippes, deciphered the letter. When he read the fatal passage, he drew a small gallows on the outside of the letter as a grim joke. The proof was secured. The bosom serpent had finally bitten. On a bright August day, Mary was invited to go hunting in the park at Chartley. It was a rare treat. As she rode across the grass, she was intercepted by horsemen. They were not rescuers. They were Walsingham's men. She was arrested. Her secretaries were seized. Her papers were confiscated. She was told the game was over. They moved her to the grim fortress of Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire. It was a place known for its damp marshes and dark history. As she passed under the heavy portcullis, Mary Stuart must have known she would never walk out alive. Fotheringhay Castle was more than a prison. It was a courtroom designed for a single purpose: to destroy a queen. In October 1586, the great hall of the castle was prepared for the trial. At one end, a chair of state was placed under a canopy to represent the absent Queen Elizabeth I. Opposite it, a simple chair with a velvet cushion was placed for the defendant. When Mary Stuart entered the hall on October 14th, she was a shadow of the Golden Girl of France. She was 43, but looked 60. Her hair was gray, her body swollen with dropsy, and she walked with a limp, supported by her physician. Yet her mind was as sharp as a diamond. The trial was a legal anomaly. Mary was not an English subject. She was an anointed Queen of Scotland. She argued passionately that an English court had no jurisdiction over her. "I am a queen," she told the commissioners, her voice ringing through the hall. "I am not a subject of the Queen of England. I will not answer to your laws, which I do not know and have never accepted." She faced 46 of the finest legal minds in England, alone, without a lawyer, without notes, and without being allowed to see the evidence against her. For 2 days she parried their questions with extraordinary skill. When they accused her of plotting to kill Elizabeth, she demanded to see the letters. They refused. "You are my enemies," she said, scanning the rows of stony-faced men. "I am alone among you. The theater of the world is wider than the realm of England." But the verdict was never in doubt. The evidence of the Babington plot, however it was obtained, was damning in their eyes. On October 25th, the Star Chamber in London pronounced the sentence: Mary Stuart was guilty of plotting the death of the Queen. The punishment was death. For 3 months silence fell. Parliament demanded the execution. The people of London lit bonfires in anticipation. But Queen Elizabeth I hesitated. To kill a crowned monarch was to break the great chain of being. It was a divine taboo. Elizabeth believed that kings and queens were accountable only to God. If she executed Mary, she was admitting that a sovereign could be judged by mortals, a precedent that could one day be used against her own successors. Elizabeth agonized. She stopped sleeping. She was heard muttering to herself, "Ut feri, ne feriare feri." Either bear the blow or strike it. Strike lest you be struck. Finally, driven by rumors of Spanish invasion and the relentless pressure of William Cecil and Walsingham, she broke. On February 1st, 1587, she called for the death warrant. She signed it quickly, almost casually, amidst a stack of other papers, and dropped it on the floor. Her secretary, William Davison, snatched it up. The Privy Council, knowing Elizabeth might change her mind again, secretly dispatched the warrant to Fotheringhay without telling her. They wanted the deed done before the Queen could retract it. On Tuesday, February 7th, 1587, the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent arrived at Fotheringhay. They entered Mary's chamber and read the warrant. She was to die the next morning at 8 a.m. Mary crossed herself and smiled. "I thank you for such welcome news," she said. "You will do me a great good in withdrawing me from this world, out of which I am very glad to go." She spent her final night not in panic, but in serene preparation. She viewed herself not as a failed politician, but as a Catholic martyr dying for her faith. She wrote her will, carefully distributing her meager belongings to her servants. She wrote a final letter to the King of France, her brother-in-law. She ate a modest supper, toasted her weeping servants, and then spent the rest of the night in prayer. She did not sleep. The morning of Wednesday, February 8th, 1587, was cold and gray. At 8 a.m., the sheriff knocked on her door. Mary was ready. She was dressed in a gown of black satin velvet trimmed with gold with a long train. On her head was a white veil that reached to her feet. Around her neck hung a crucifix, and at her belt a rosary. She was helped down the stairs because her legs were too weak to carry her. At the bottom of the stairs, she was met by Sir Andrew Melville, her steward. He fell to his knees, weeping. "Madam, it will be the sorrowfulest message that ever I carried, when I shall report that my queen and dear mistress is dead." "Weep not, good Melville," she replied, "but rather rejoice. For thou shalt this day see Mary Stuart's troubles come to an end." She entered the great hall. A scaffold 2 feet high and draped in black cloth had been erected in the center. 300 spectators stood in silence. Mary mounted the scaffold with dignity. She sat and listened while the Dean of Peterborough, a Protestant cleric, began to preach at her, urging her to repent. Mary interrupted him. "Mr. Dean, I am settled in the ancient Catholic Roman religion, and mine to shed my blood for it." When he continued to pray, she turned her back on him and began to pray in Latin, her voice drowning his out. Then came the moment of revelation. Her ladies, weeping uncontrollably, helped her remove her black outer gown. The gasp from the crowd was audible. Underneath the black, Mary was wearing a bodice and petticoat of deep crimson velvet. In the symbolism of the time, red was the color of martyrdom. She was proclaiming to the world that she was dying for the Catholic Church. It was a final, brilliant act of defiance. She bid her servants farewell, blindfolded herself with a gold-embroidered cloth, and knelt before the block. She recited the psalm in Latin, "In te Domine speravi," "In thee, O Lord, have I put my trust." She laid her head on the block. She stretched out her arms, the signal for the strike, and whispered, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner, a man named Bull, was nervous. The atmosphere was suffocating. He raised the axe and swung. He missed. The blade did not sever the neck. It struck the back of her head, biting into the skull. A terrible low groan escaped the queen's lips. The executioner swung again. This blow severed the neck, but not completely. A piece of sinew still held the head to the body. He had to use the axe as a saw to cut through the final piece of flesh. Finally, the head was severed. The executioner lifted it high by the hair, shouting the traditional cry, "God save the Queen!" But the horror was not over. As he held the head, the beautiful auburn curls came away in his hand. It was a wig. The head dropped to the wooden stage with a sickening thud, rolling away to reveal the short, gray stubble hair of an old woman. As the spectators stared in shock at the severed head, they noticed a movement in the crimson skirts of the body. A small dog, a Skye Terrier, crept out. It had hidden itself in the folds of her dress. The little dog was covered in blood, shivering, and refused to leave its mistress's body. It had to be forcibly removed and washed. When news reached London, bonfires were lit. But at the palace, Elizabeth I collapsed into a rage. She claimed she never meant for the warrant to be sent, that it was a mistake. She imprisoned her secretary Davison in the Tower. It was a political performance, but her guilt haunted her for the remaining 16 years of her life. Mary's body was embalmed and left unburied at Fotheringhay for months, before eventually being interred at Peterborough Cathedral. But history plays the long game. Elizabeth I died in 1603, childless. The Tudor dynasty died with her. The next king of England was James VI of Scotland, Mary Stuart's son. He became James I of England, uniting the two crowns at last. The lass had brought the crown, and her bloodline would keep it. In 1612, King James moved his mother's body to Westminster Abbey. He built her a magnificent marble tomb in the Henry VII Chapel. It is a towering monument, slightly larger and grander than the tomb of Elizabeth I, which lies in the opposite aisle. Today, if you visit the Abbey, you can stand between them. The two rival queens, who never met in life, rest only feet apart in death. But while Elizabeth's line ended, Mary is the ancestor of every monarch of Great Britain who has followed, right down to the present day. During her long captivity, Mary had embroidered a motto onto her canopy of state. It read, "En ma fin, j'ai mon commencement." In my end is my beginning. She was right. Her death was not a defeat. It was the foundation of a dynasty. The tragic Queen of Scots had won the war of history.